Hello, Robs. We're back with We Gather Together, the story of Thanksgiving by Ralph and Adelin Linton. Linton. Chapter 6, Other New England Thanksgivings. There was no Thanksgiving feast the following autumn. The harvest was too meager to give cause for rejoicing or to permit hospitality, but 2 years after the first festival, on the 30th of July, 1623, the Pilgrims held a day of Thanksgiving, which some authorities hold to be the first real Thanksgiving, since it was the first day that was formally set apart by the governor as a day of prayer. It was not a harvest festival, but a public time of thankfulness to the divine providence, which saved the colony from drought and starvation. The feeling of security and gratitude which their first fall crops had given the Pilgrims was short-lived. When the harvest festival was over and cold weather was approaching, they took an exact account of all their provisions in store and proportioned the same to the number of persons, and found that it would not hold out above 6 months at half allowance, and hardly that. There had been great rejoicing when another ship from home was sighted coming into Plymouth Harbor, but the enthusiasm cooled when they discovered that the Fortune was bringing 35 new colonists and no provisions. This meant more hands to work, but also more mouths to be fed from the already meager stores. Their corn was exhausted except what they had to save for seed, since they could not expect to come upon any further Indian stores. The game that had been so plentiful in the woods and marshes in the autumn disappeared with the coming of winter, as did the eels and herring and lobsters, which had been easily caught along the shore and in the streams. There were plenty of fish in the sea, but the colonists had no gear for deep-sea fishing. In these straits, wrote Winslow, such was our state, as, in the morning, we had often our food to seek for the day, and yet performed the duties of our calling. And that, at times in some seasons at noon, I have seen men stagger by reason of faintness for want of food. Yet ere night, by the good providence and blessing of God, we have enjoyed such plenty as though the windows of heaven had opened up to us. In midsummer, the white sails of 2 more ships were sighted in the bay. Again, the Pilgrims' hopes ran high. These ships were the Charity and the Swan, bringing 60 men to settle in the colony, but they carried little with them except unpleasant letters from the Pilgrims' backers in England, who were disappointed that they had not received valuable cargoes of furs and fish from the colony. This indeed was cold comfort for hungry bellies. Among these later arrivals were some highly undesirable characters who stole from the scanty stores of food and stirred up so much trouble with the Indians that Bradford had to send Squanto to Massasoit to explain that these people were a distinct body from us, and we have nothing to do with them. Nevertheless, these irresponsible settlers had caused such ill feeling that the Pilgrims had to take precious time from their farming to build a stockade for protection from the savages. Fortunately, they were never attacked. This may have been due partly to the fact that Squanto told the Indians that the Pilgrims kept the plague buried under the common house in barrels. The barrels really held gunpowder, but since the Indians were much more afraid of the white man's diseases than they were of his pieces, this proved to be a very effective check on aggression. The first threat of bacteriological warfare, even if an empty one. The winter of 1623 was a grim one, and in the spring, drought set in, which lasted from the 3rd week in May until well into July. The precious crops withered, and the colonists were in despair. The governor appointed the day for fasting and prayer, and after 9 hours of supplication to the deity, clouds moved across the sky from the sea, and blotted out the burning sun. By morning, a gentle rain was falling, reviving the scorched fields and also the spirits of the colonists. A few days later, Captain Standish, who had gone off on a journey to forage for food, returned, bringing not only fresh supplies, but the news that the Anne was approaching. A ship bearing many of the friends who had been left behind in Leyden when there was not room for them on the Mayflower. In view of these blessings, the governor proclaimed the 30th of July, 1623, as a day of prayer and thanksgiving for the entire colony. As was said above, this may be counted as the first real Thanksgiving Day, since it was the first time that a day was appointed officially by the governor for both religious and social celebration. On February 22nd, 1630, a day of public thanksgiving was held in Boston by the Bay Colony. This was in celebration of the safe arrival of ships bringing food and friends from Europe. In 1665, the Court of Connecticut Public Records notes that this court doth appoint a solemn day of thanksgiving to be kept throughout this colony on the last Wednesday of October for the blessing of the fruits of the earth and the general health of the plantations. All these colonial Thanksgivings were regional holidays, and though they were proclaimed in a religious spirit, family reunion, feasting, and free hospitality were always the spirit of the day. Each colony appointed its own Thanksgiving date, but sometimes the various townships ignored the proclamations and held Thanksgiving at whatever time suited their own convenience. For example, the town of Colchester disregarded the appointed day and held its festival a week later in order to allow time for the arrival of a hogshead of molasses that was due in by sloop from New York. After all, how could they celebrate Thanksgiving without molasses for pumpkin pies and Indian pudding? A diary kept by Juliana Smith of Massachusetts in 1779 gives an account of an early New England Thanksgiving. This was written as a letter to a cousin, Betsy Smith, but Juliana, not wishing any of her fine phrases to be lost, copied it off in her diary also. One of her descendants, Helen Evertson Smith, discovered the diary and permitted it to be published. The letter reads in part, "This year it was Uncle Simeon's turn to have the dinner at his house, but of course we all help them as they help us when it's our turn. And there is always enough for us all to do, and the baking of pies and cakes was done at our house, and we had the big oven heated and filled twice each day for 3 days before it was all done, and everything was good, though we did have to do without some things that ought to be used. Neither love nor paper money could buy raisins, but our good red cherries dried without the pits did almost as well, and happily Uncle Simeon still had some spices in store. The tables were set in the dining hall, and even that big room had no space to spare when we were all seated. The servants had enough ado to get around the tables and serve us all without oversetting things. There were our 2 grandmothers side by side. They are always handsome old ladies, but now many thought they were handsomer than ever, and happy they were to look around upon so many of their descendants. Uncle and Aunt Simeon presided at one table, and father and mother at the other. Besides us 5 boys and girls, there were 2 of the Gales and 3 Elmers, besides James Brown. Hey, James Brown was there. And Ephraim Cowles. 5 of the last named 7 were orphans taught and in all ways provided for by Parson and Mrs. Smith. We had them at our table because they could be best supervised there. Most of the students had gone to their own homes for the weeks, but Mr. Skiff and Mr. name illegible were too far away from their homes. They sat at Uncle Simeon's table, and so did Uncle Paul and his family, 5 of them in all, and cousins Finn and Powell, probably Phineas and Apollos Smith, sons of Dan. Then there were 6 of the Livingston family next door. They had never seen a Thanksgiving dinner before, having been used to keep Christmas Day instead, as is the wont in New York and Province. Then there were 4 old ladies who have no longer homes or children of their own, and so came to us. They were invited by my mother, but Uncle and Aunt Simeon wished it so. Of course, we could have no roast beef. None of us have tasted beef this 3 years back, as it all must go to the army, and too little they get, poor fellows. But nay, Quiddy's ma hunters were able to get us a fine red deer, so that we had a good haunch of venison on each table. These were balanced by huge chines of roast pork at the other ends of the tables. Then there was on one a big roast turkey, and on the other a goose and two big pigeon pasties. Then there was an abundance of good vegetables of all old sorts, and one which I do not believe you have seen yet. You have yet seen. Uncle Simeon had imported the seed from England just before the war began, and only this year was there enough for table use. It is called celery, and you eat it without cooking. It is very good served with meats. Next year, Uncle Simeon says he will be able to raise enough to give us all some. It has to be taken up, roots and all, and buried in the earth in the cellar through the winter, and only pulling up some when you want it to use. Our mince pies were good, although we had to use dried cherries, as I told you. And the meat was shoulder of venison instead of beef. The pumpkin pies, apple tarts, and big Indian puddings lacked for nothing save appetite by the time we had got round to them. Of course, we had no wine. Uncle Simeon has still a cask or two, but it must all be saved for the sick, and indeed for those who are well. Good cider is a sufficient substitute. There was no plum pudding, but a boiled suet pudding, stirred thick with dried plums and cherries, was called by the old name and answered the purpose. All the other spice had been used in the mince pies, so for this pudding we used a jar of West India preserved ginger, which chanced to be left of the last shipment which Uncle Simeon had from there. We chopped the ginger small and stirred it through with the plums and cherries. It was extraordinary good. Should be extraordinarily good. The day was bitter cold, and when we got home from meeting, which father did not keep over long by reason of the cold, we were glad enough of the fire in Uncle's dining hall. But by the time the dinner was one half over, those of us who were on the fireside of one table was forced to get up and carry our plates with us around to the far side of the other table, while those who had sat there were as glad to bring their plates around to the fireside to get warm. All but the old ladies who had a screen put behind their chairs. Uncle Simeon was in his best mood, and you know how good that is. He kept both tables in a roar of laughter with his droll stories of the days when he was studying medicine in Edinburgh. And afterwards he and Father and Uncle Paul joined in singing hymns and ballads. You know how fine their voices go together. Then we all sang a hymn, and afterwards my dear Father led us in prayer, remembering all absent friends before the throne of grace. And much I wish that my dear Betsy was here as one of us, as she has been of yore. We did not rise from the table until it was quite dark, and then when the dishes had been cleared away, we all got round the fire as close as we could, and cracked nuts and sang songs and told stories. At least some told and others listened. You know, nobody can exceed the two grandmothers at telling tales of all the things they have seen themselves and repeating those of the early years in New England, and even some in the old England, which they had heard in their youth from their elders. My father says it is a goodly custom to hand down all worthy deeds and traditions from father to son, as the Israelites were commanded to do about the Passover, and as the Indians here have always done, because the word that is spoken is remembered longer than the one that is written. Brother Jack, who did not reach here until late on Wednesday, though he had left college very early on Monday morning, and rode with all due diligence considering the snow, brought an orange to each of the grandmothers, but alas, they were frozen in his saddlebags. We soaked the frost out in cold water, but I guess they wasn't as good as they should have been. The menus of such old-fashioned dinners cannot but lead the calorie-counting, finger-conscious modern to shudder at the lusty appetites of his forebears. I mean, they were half starving to death. After these collations, the older members retired in a glassy-eyed stupor for an after-dinner snooze, or a bit of quiet gossip and reminiscence. But for the youngsters, there were after-dinner games, which were as traditional for Thanksgiving as ducking for apples is for Halloween. One of these was the cranberry contest. The players, each supplied with a large needle and a long, coarse thread, stood around a big bowl of raw cranberries. At a given signal, all pitched in and threaded as many cranberries as he could in the allotted 3 minutes. The one who strung the most cranberries won a prize and the privilege of hanging his ruby necklace about the neck of his chosen one with the accompaniment of a hearty kiss. Another Thanksgiving entertainment was the corn game. The properties needed for this game were 5 ears of dried corn and, of course, a prize for the winner. The 5 ears of corn were in tribute to the 5 grains of corn, which, legend has it, were the daily ration of the pilgrims during the second grim winter. The corn was hidden about the house, and the finders were the finalists in the game. The other players standing about and cheering while these 5 vied to see who could strip the cob of its kernels in the shortest time. The pumpkin race was another Thanksgiving sport. The contestants lined up, each with a small pumpkin and a wooden spoon. The prize in this case was awarded to the one who could roll his pumpkin to the finish line first, since the pumpkin is a lopsided fruit and the contestants could use only the spoon to guide it. The wobbling course provided much hilarity. A favorite Thanksgiving custom among the youngsters was the practice of dressing in fantastic costume, putting on masks or painting faces, and parading through the streets on Thanksgiving morning, begging from passers-by. The mummery started as a reenactment of the coming of the Indians to the Pilgrim Feast. One can still see on the streets of eastern cities at Thanksgiving such gangs of oddly costumed children, usually from the poorer classes, and of course unaware of the historical background of their prank. And that's the end of chapter 6. Sometimes shoddily read, but that's what happens when you just wake up and start reading, I guess. Although I fumble it during other times of the day as well. Anyway, that's going to be all for now, bruv. This book's almost over. And November has just started. We got it together, bruv. This book waits in the wings. Murder. Thanksgiving murder. All right, bruvs. Goodbye.